In this video, we'll be talking about the Week 2, Part 1 lecture notes. For this part, we'll be discussing a number of different things. First, we'll be talking about ethical relativism. Ethical relativism is the notion that there are no standards. We'll talk about the fact that ethical relativism is illogical. And because ethical relativism is illogical, we can think about the different types of ethical theories or approaches we can use. Now, this is very important, and this forms the basis for the different types of ethical approaches you can use or the different rules or standards that you can apply for ethical judgment. Now, these boundaries or 9 standards that we're going to be talking about are very important because this is going to help us to figure out how laws are generated to deal with the accounting profession and how the accounting profession itself creates rules and pronouncements for their practitioners to follow. Finally, we'll talk about the different types of arguments that you can have. We'll talk about sound arguments or arguments that are not sound. We'll talk about valid arguments and invalid arguments. First, I'd like to discuss this notion of ethical relativism. Now, this standard states that there is no acceptable standard, that rules just depend on whatever society you're in. And basically, ethical relativism is the idea that everything is relative, that since there are no standards or really no rules that you can think about, then basically anything can go. Now, ethical relativism is an argument that's used to justify having no standards or rules within a profession. And ethical relativism states a couple things. First, we can say that if you believe in ethical relativism, then it means that there's no such thing as moral progress. So moral progress cannot exist if you believe in ethical relativism because there's no such thing as right versus wrong. Basically, anything goes. If you are a proponent of ethical relativism, then it means that you can't make a judgment on anybody's culture. You can't make a judgment on any set of standards that might exist because as an ethical relativist, you'd have to accept that slavery is okay because ethical relativism states that there are no right and wrong answers. If you are an ethical relativist, you can also simply only ask one question. And that question is, are you living up to your own standards? And that's about it. So this notion of ethical relativism is actually very illogical. Because if there are more than one standards that, or more than one set of rules that can exist, it doesn't mean that any set of standards or rules can be okay. This is a very common misconception when it comes to business ethics and accounting ethics, because people look at ethics and they think, oh, well, any standard can exist, any rule can be okay, so it really means that we don't have to study ethics as a field of study. That doesn't make a lot of sense, because maybe when it comes to accounting ethics, you can have multiple different standards or multiple different approaches to something. But just because you have more than one quote-unquote answer, it doesn't mean that any single answer is going to be okay or that every answer is incorrect. So what you need to know is that ethical relativism is this notion that there is no acceptable standard, but that's illogical. Ethical relativism is illogical because if you think that there is no acceptable standard, then isn't that a standard in itself? That's what makes it illogical. It's like saying, for example, everything I say is wrong. Well, then doesn't that mean that that statement, everything I say is wrong, should also be wrong? If ethical relativism is illogical, then that means that there are different approaches to ethical thinking. So we're going to study 9 different approaches, and the 9 different approaches are going to help to inform and create a framework for our later study of law and accounting, accounting pronouncements, accounting rules and regulations, and also accounting ethics. But first, let's talk about a little bit of background. First, you can think of ethics in terms of historical or conceptual perspectives. Historical just means what happened in the past. So historical is very journalistic in nature. It's just explaining what people think or thought in the past. What did the ancient Romans think was correct or incorrect? If you go a step further and try to analyze, then you can think of ethics more conceptually, or you can think of ethics from a conceptual perspective. This involves the why. Why do people think the way they do? What are the different standards or approaches that we use to try to understand why accounting ethics says that objectivity is a very important concept? Additionally, we can think about ethics in more detail, and we can define this term ethics by talking about three different frameworks. We can think of ethics as descriptive ethics, which is really the same as the historical perspective. Descriptive ethics just talks about describing what actually is. Okay, so if I tell you that a car is red, that's descriptive in nature. I'm not trying to understand why it's red. I'm just explaining that it is red. I'm just telling you what I see. If you go a step further, we can talk about metaethics. Metaethics is this notion of why do people think a certain way. If I say here, the car is red, that's descriptive ethics. If I say why is the car red, then that's metaethics. It's trying to understand the meaning of something or why something occurred. When you talk about normative ethics, that's an even higher level, and you're going a step further and asking the question how people should act. With the example of the red car, if I say, should people buy a red car, then that's a normative ethics type of question. Okay? It's very important to remember that normative ethics typically has this word should in it. Should makes it a normative ethics question. Okay? Whereas why is more of a metaethics question. And a simple statement of fact is more of a descriptive ethics matter. In this class, we're studying ethics in accounting and business. Which one of the three different approaches do you think we're going to be dealing with? Maybe a little bit of all three, but which one do you think is the approach or method of thinking that's most important in this class? It's normative ethics. Okay, so what should people do? How should people act? How should the American Institute of Public Accountants create a new pronouncement or standard? So normative ethics is very important. Next, let's think about the boundaries of ethics. So ethics can be, as you can see here, personal, it can be organizational, or it can be systemic. So you can think of this as being small, medium, or large. So when you think about questions of ethics, are you thinking about what's right versus what's wrong just for yourself? That's personal. Are you thinking about what's right versus what's wrong for the company that you work for? That's an organization. Are you thinking about what's right versus what's wrong for American University? That would be a question of organizational ethics. If you're thinking about what's right versus wrong for all accounting firms or all universities, then that's more of a systemic approach to ethics. So in the textbook, it talks about the fact that ethics is where you have to make a trade-off, or you have something that's high stakes in nature. The example that I gave in the prior lecture was to talk about dumping toxic chemicals in a lake. So if that's a question that you have to wrestle with, if that's an ethical dilemma, then you could argue that dumping toxic chemicals in a lake impacts you, yourself, if you're the CEO of the company. It's going to impact, it's a question that the whole organization has to think about, and it's something that could be harmful to the environment or to other people. So that's more of a systemic approach to ethics. So you can see that systemic boundaries of ethics, or thinking about ethics from a systemic perspective, is much more difficult than thinking about ethics from a personal perspective. If I'm trying to think about what's right for just myself, that's an easier question, arguably, to answer because you have fewer trade-offs to make relative to thinking about what's ethical for a whole system. In other words, for everybody that's out there. So if we look at ethics and we say that ethical relativism doesn't make sense, it's illogical, then we can put everything together and look at ethics from 9 different approaches. So you can see there's really 3 triangles here, and there's 9 different approaches to ethical decision making, or 9 different approaches to thinking about ethics. Okay, so when we take a look at these 9 different standards, you can see that we have egoism, utilitarianism, Sidgwick's dualism, divine command theory, okay, so on and so forth. So the easiest way to understand this is to think about it in this manner. On the left side, you have teleological. You can think about ethics from a teleological perspective. What's another word for teleological? It starts with the letter C. Consequential, right? Consequentialist approach. So you can think of ethics from a consequentialist or teleological approach. That's on the left side. Or you can think about ethics from a deontological perspective, or you can use a deontological approach to think about ethics. What's another word for deontological? Starts with the letter N. Non-consequentialist. So you can either have a teleological or consequentialist approach to ethics, or as we'll see, the law and accounting standards, or you can have a deontological or non-consequentialist approach to creating laws in accounting and ethical standards in accounting. And look at the middle here. The middle says mixed. Okay, so we have the mixed approach. Mixed combines teleological and deontological together. Okay, so it has both here in the middle. Now, let's take a look at teleological. Remember, this is consequentialism. So there are 3 types of consequentialist approaches when you think about ethics and ethical decision making. You have egoism, Sidgwick's dualism, and utilitarianism. The best way to understand these differences is to think that egoism is only about yourself. It's a very narrow scope, so only about yourself. Utilitarianism means about everybody else. Okay, so utilitarianism is about everybody else. Sidgwick's dualism is about yourself and everybody else. Okay, so one more time. Egoism, yourself. Utilitarianism, everybody else. Sidgwick's dualism is about yourself and everybody else. Let's take a look over here. Existentialism is about yourself. Contractarianism is about everyone else. And Kant's ethics is about yourself and everyone else. Intuitionalism is about yourself. Love ethics is about everyone else. And divine command theory is about yourself and everyone else. Now, let's go through and then define each of these together. And let's start with egoism. Okay, so I'm going to have a Word file here and then egoism. Okay, so egoism is when you're only concerned about the end result for yourself. Okay, so for example, let's say that somebody wants to become a partner. So if you want to become a partner in an accounting firm and the end result is the only thing that matters, the end result being that you become a partner in an accounting firm, and it doesn't matter what you have to do to get there. You'll work 50 hours a week, 100 hours a week, it doesn't really matter. Then we can say that that would be a form of egoism. Now, I want you to be careful because people look at this word egoism. They think, oh, ego is always a bad thing. Okay, ego is just the terminology or nomenclature that's used. So I'm not trying to say that somebody that's an egoist is necessarily ethical or unethical. I'm just saying that this is one ethical standard or approach that you can use to think about ethical decision making. Let's talk about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, remember, is about everyone else. So utilitarianism is where you want the best result for everyone else. Okay, so for example, let's say that I want to build a road, and the road is going to help a great many number of people. Okay, so I'm going to create a new road that benefits many people. However, this road happens to go through my own house. So if this road goes through my own house, then obviously that's not a good end result for me, but it is a good end result for everyone else. So if I'm a utilitarian, then I would say go ahead and build that road that goes through my house because everyone else is better off. So if I have a new road that benefits many people, I would want the road to be built because everyone else benefits. Okay, and then of course maybe not myself because it goes through my house. But remember, utilitarianism is interested in everyone else getting a certain consequence or end result, right? Remember, teleological is about the end result. Okay, Sidgwick's dualism is where you want the best end result for yourself and for everyone else. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So here, you want the best end result or consequence for yourself and everyone else. Okay, I have an example here. So for this example, a real life example, I am actually the advisor for the business ethics team from our school. So I take a group of students to the International Business Ethics Compliance Officers case competition, which is in Los Angeles. And when I take students with me, I want everyone else and myself to have a nice, comfortable room or hotel to stay in. Okay, that's the end result that I want. So I always try to book a hotel that's close to where the competition is going to be. I try to book a hotel that's close to a lot of nice restaurants and a lot of fun activities that are nearby the hotel. So I'm using a Sidgwick's dualist approach to ethics. So I'm trying to get the best end result for myself and for everyone else. So here, as an example, we can think about reserving a nice hotel because you want yourself to be comfortable and everyone else. Okay, so remember, these three standards deal with being a consequentialist. So now if you're a consequentialist or if you follow a teleological approach, there are three types of consequentialist approaches. So now you can see what they are. What are the three types of non-consequentialist approaches? Remember, non-consequentialism is here. Okay, so let's write these down here. We have existentialist or existentialism. Remember, that's about yourself. What about if I'm trying to do the right thing and I'm talking about everybody else? That's called contractarianism. What about if I think that myself and everyone else should act a certain way? We should focus on actions. Actions are the most important thing for myself and for everyone else. That's called Kant's ethics. So when you read the chapter, you'll see that the chapter talks about these different approaches to ethics, and it explains it in a little bit of a different way. So the way that I'm explaining it is more of, I think, a structured approach. So you can use my explanation and the book's explanation to complement each other to help you understand these different ideas. Existentialism is where I think the right action for myself is most important. Okay, so existentialism means that you have to do the right thing for yourself, and you're not really worried about the consequence. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Let's say that I want to be true to myself. True to myself. I think you hear people say that a lot of times. If I want to be true to myself and I decide that for me, doing the right thing is not having a job. So I don't want a job. I only want to surf every day. Okay, so the consequences, I probably won't make much money. I probably might have trouble paying rent. I may not have any health insurance, but this is the right thing for me to do because actions are the most important thing. Remember, deontological means non-consequential. Non-consequential or non-consequentialism means action needs to be prioritized or intent needs to be prioritized. So if I'm worried about the action just for myself, I'm worried about doing the right thing for myself, then you can say that you are a existentialist. What about if I say that everyone else should do the right thing? That's called contractarianism. Everyone else needs to do the right thing. In other words, the actions for everyone else are most important. So contractarianism is sort of like telling other people that they have to act a certain way, but maybe those actions don't apply to yourself. Okay, so again, I don't want to try to paint these different approaches by saying that one is better than the other. I'm just trying to use extreme examples or simple examples to help you understand the idea. So contractarianism might be someone that's a hypocrite. Okay, so if someone is a hypocrite, they say do something or act some way, but you're telling everyone else what they should do. But the advice is for everyone else. Okay, it's a contractarianist approach. Okay, you can think of contractarianism also in the terms of making a contract. So if I make a contract where my employer has to keep me employed for 3 years, they have to provide an office for me, or they have to provide a good work environment for me for 3 years, right? Then you're telling someone else what they have to do. They have to act a certain way. That's contractarianism. Kant's ethics is saying that the proper action is most important, remember, for yourself and everyone else. Now, Kant's ethics is easier to think about because what if I say everyone needs to be honest, including myself? That's simply a Kantian ethics way of thinking. If I say everyone must be honest, including myself and everyone else. Okay? That would be Kant's ethics. Okay, so these are the deontological approaches that you need to know. Okay, so let's go back to the chart here. We talked about the 3 teleological approaches on the left. We talked about the 3 deontological approaches on the right side. And then we have what's called the mixed framework approach to thinking about ethics. Okay, so let's think about what these mean. Remember, intuitionalism is about yourself. Love ethics is about someone else, everyone else. And divine command is about yourself and everyone else. Okay. So we have intuitionalism, that's about yourself. Love ethic is about everyone else. And divine command is about yourself and everyone else. Now, what all 3 of these different approaches have in common is that these 3 approaches are what we call a mixed framework approach. Mixed means that you're asking the question, what's the most important thing? Is it the consequence or is it the intent and action? And here, for these 3 approaches, you're saying both are equally important. So if you think that the end result and the action, how you do something, are both equally important, then these are the 3 different approaches you can use. Now, intuitionalism is this notion that you think that doing the right thing is important for yourself and the end result is important for yourself. Here we're saying that you think rules for yourself apply, but exceptions may exist. Okay, so let me give you an example. Let's say that you're an intuitionalist. So this is about yourself. So you follow the rules. For example, you follow the speed limit because doing the right thing is important. But sometimes it's not about doing the right thing, it's about the end result. So for example, you follow the speed limit because you do the right thing. However, if there's some kind of an emergency and you need to take your friend to the hospital, then maybe you will speed and then run some red lights because the end result, getting to the hospital, is the most important thing in that circumstance. Right? So you can see intuitionalism is this notion that you follow rules or you think actions are important, but sometimes there's an exception, and there's an exception when the end result is something that is more important in that situation. Okay, so love ethic is really like intuitionalism. Okay, so rules are important for other people, but exceptions exist. Okay, so these 2 sound like they're the same. Now the difference is really just the locus of control. So for intuitionalism, you follow rules, but you decide when an exception exists. So you decide when an exception exists. So you make the judgment. Okay. So maybe you hear people say, "Oh, if you work at a restaurant," I used to work at a restaurant. They would say, "Okay, don't ever take out more than 2 different products to show the customer at the same time. But you use your judgment. Sometimes it's okay to bend the rules, right? You decide. So you decide when there is going to be an exception." For love ethics, who decides? Someone else decides when an exception exists. Okay, so this is someone else. Okay, so people get caught up with the terminology and they look at the word love. So does love have something to do with this? Not necessarily. This is just the nomenclature that's used. So let's say that I think it's important to always eat healthy, but sometimes I can bend the rules and make an exception. Sometimes going to a fast food restaurant where the food tastes really good, is more important. I want a certain end result. And when is that exception made? Well, someone else is going to decide. Maybe because it's my friend's birthday and they really want to go. So I'll let them make the call. Okay, so that would be love ethic. Okay, divine command is where you believe that rules are important. It's important to do the right thing, but again, exceptions exist. And who decides when there's going to be an exception? You and someone else. So you negotiate when there's going to be an exception, you and somebody else. Let's have a discussion. Okay, so we're going to make sure that everybody works 40 hours this week. But this is a very interesting week. There's a lot of work to do. So maybe we should bend the rule and then just have everybody work overtime, but only just this week. We're doing this week as an exception because we have an important project that's coming due. So we need to make sure that the project gets done. The consequence is the most important thing this week. So I'm going to negotiate with my fellow coworkers. We're going to arrive at some type of decision here, and we may decide to bend the rules. Okay, so that would be divine command theory. Okay, so are you somebody that thinks the end result is always the most important thing? That would be here. Do you think that doing the right thing is the most important thing? Then you would be here. Do you think that it's important to follow the rules, to do the right thing, but sometimes the end result is more important? Then you would be here at the bottom. Now, I want to point out also that we're not one approach 100% of the time. I think it's very hard to find somebody that's always 100% egoist or follows egoism all the time, no matter what situation they're in. Depending on the situation, then you may be an egoist in one situation, or you may be a contractarian in a different situation. But these approaches are important because when it comes to ethical thinking, there are 9 different approaches. And when you look at different laws or accounting pronouncements, then you'll see that laws and accounting pronouncements actually follow one of these 9 different approaches. Okay, so one of these 9 different approaches. So I'll give you an example real quick, and we're going to be going over more examples as the course progresses. But this notion of eminent domain. What is eminent domain? Eminent domain is a legal precedent or a standard in the law that says that the government can force someone to sell land even if that person doesn't want to. Okay, so going back to a previous example, what if the government was going to put a very important highway that's going to help many, many people, and the highway needs to go through my house? If the highway doesn't go through my house, the highway cannot be built. Under this notion of eminent domain, the government can force me to sell my land and take my land from me in order to build a highway, because the government says that building the highway and helping more people is the most important concept here. the end result is the most important thing. The end result for everyone else is what's most important. So if you look at this notion of eminent domain, what basis in ethics is eminent domain based on? Look at these different standards here. Eminent domain is based on what ethical standard? The answer is utilitarianism. Okay? So we can see that when you have different legal or ethical standards under the law and in accounting, they're based on 9 different approaches. Okay, going back to the notes, let's talk about a few other things here. Okay, so let's talk about types of arguments. Okay, so we talked about different standards, and we need to talk about an argument. Okay, so arguments are either good or bad. The best arguments are going to be sound and logical. Okay, so the best argument that you can make, if you're making an ethical decision or you're trying to establish a certain law or standard, then the best approach you can use is one approach where you have sound and valid thinking. Okay, so sound means that the facts are accurate. Okay, if you make an argument and you use facts, if you use data that's accurate, that's called sound. If you make an argument using incorrect data, that's called unsound. If you're logical, it also means that that's valid. If you're illogical, that's called invalid. So arguments have to be sound and logical. Okay, so let me give you one example here. Let me give you an example of an argument that is unsound but valid. Okay? So that means unsound means that it's inaccurate. So I'm going to use inaccurate, wrong information, but I'm going to make a valid argument. It's going to be logical. Okay? What if I say all women are mothers? Okay, that's not true. Okay, not all women are mothers. Okay, so some women are not mothers. Okay, so this is obviously inaccurate, right? So this is unsound. But what if I say all women are mothers? Jill is a woman. Therefore, Jill is a mother. Okay. So here's an argument. Okay, now all women are mothers, not true. This is not sound, unsound. But does my reasoning make sense? All women are mothers. Jill happens to be a woman, so Jill is a mother. Yeah, that's actually valid. That's logical. Okay? So this is important to think about because when we talk about ethical decision making, remember all arguments have to be sound and logical, or they have to be sound and another word for logical is valid. Okay, 2 more things I want to discuss. Imperatives. Okay, so imperatives are very important under the law because we have 2 kinds of imperatives. So a hypothetical imperative is something that you can opt out of. Okay, so it's optional. Just think hypothetical imperative is optional. Okay. Categorical imperative is mandatory. So let me give you an example of a hypothetical imperative. Let's say passing the pilot license test. Okay, let's say I tell you, you need to pass the pilot license test. Well, you can say, well, no, I don't have to pass the pilot license test because I don't want to be a pilot. That's optional for me. What about a categorical imperative? What if I say, you want to become an airline pilot? Then I say, is it important for you to pass the pilot license test? The answer is yes. If you want to be a pilot, passing the pilot license test is a categorical imperative. You must do that. You must pass the test if you want to be a pilot. The chapter talks about the fact that moral obligations are categorical imperatives. So doing the right thing is something that you can't opt out of. It's not optional. You can't say, well, I'm going to decide I don't want to be ethical because those rules don't apply to you. They do apply to you. When we talk about the AICPA Code of Conduct, the different rules that are stated in the Code of Conduct are categorical imperatives if you're an accountant. Okay, so we'll talk about what those are later on in the semester. Okay. Okay, last thing I want to mention is the fact that when we talked about the 9 different standards of ethical conduct that you see here, what I want you to know is that these different standards can have different names. Okay, so you can have a synonym, like 2 different words that mean the same idea. Remember, teleological and consequentialism are the same thing. Deontological and non-consequential means the same thing. What's another word for intuitionalism? Well, intuitionalism is also called a, you can see here, prima facie obligation. And according to the book, which philosopher is most associated with this notion of intuitionalism? It's W.D. Ross. Okay. So just know that these all refer to the same thing. Okay. So I'll leave you with this thought. Intuitionalism. How would you define intuitionalism in your own words? I'll give you a couple seconds to answer that question. Of course, you can hit pause on the recording, and then how would you define intuitionalism? Okay, here's the definition that I came up with. Intuitionalism is a mixed framework, right? That means that the end result and the action are both equally important. So doing the right thing, rules and proper actions are important, but sometimes what's more important is the end result. So generally, you want to always do the right thing, but sometimes getting a certain end result is the most important thing. So if a certain end result is more important, then you can make an exception. Who decides whether an exception should be made or not? If you're an intuitionalist, it's the individual. What if you think that everyone else should decide when an exception needs to be made? That would be love ethics. What about if you and everyone else collectively discuss and decide that an exception needs to be made? That's called divine command theory.